Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Vikram Singh Mehta. I'm the chairman of Brookings India. Welcome, everyone, to our offices. Thank you very much for being here. We have a very interesting discussion ahead of us, and it's my privilege to introduce our speakers. They're well known. That's a cliche. Martin Wolf, as everyone knows, is amongst the most well-known economic journalists in the world today. Pratap Bhanu Mehta, who's in that corner you'll see, is, to my mind, one of our most insightful public intellectuals. And Surjit Bhalla, my friend, whom I haven't seen for some time, is a polymath intellectual whose writings cover every subject you can think of. He's about the only person I know who can write 1,000 words on any subject without hesitation, but it's always backed by data and logic. And his books have covered, range from economics to cricket and, of course, psephology. So it's a great privilege and pleasure for me to have the three of them here today in Brookings. And I want to express my deep gratitude to the three of them. Something has clearly gone wrong, at least as I see it. Others might say that something has changed. The world that most of us sort of grew up in, the world of the post-World War II era, the multilateral world, the rules-based world, the world that was underpinned by the neoliberal Washington consensus, that world is under convulsion. We see, the emergence of autocrats who have leveraged the hardware of democracy, elections, to, as a license, you might say, to undermine the software of democracy, civil liberties. We see the resurgence of populist nationalism. Many of us have seen the work of Thomas Piketty, and we now realize that, yes, globalization did result in growth, but it also has created soaring inequalities, and the capitalist system is on very shaky foundations. So this world that we've known, the democratic, liberal democratic world, which is underpinned by a capitalist system, that's in a state of crisis. Those of us who still believe in the free market world, those of us who still believe that the capitalist world is going to result in profits and distribution, should be reminded of what only Galbraith could have said, that you feed a horse enough oats, and some of it will spill out into the streets for the sparrows to pick up. And that is the way the world is shaping up. It's a world in crisis. And today we have Martin Wolf, who has done a lot of work on this subject, on the subject of the crisis of democratic capitalism, to speak to us about it. He's going to speak to us. I think he's going to provide us with an overview of why he believes the world of democratic capitalism is facing crisis. And then we're going to have a discussion that's going to be moderated by my colleague, Dr. Shamika Ravi, with Pratap Bhanu Mehta and Surjit Bhalla as panelists. So without further ado, let me just once again welcome you. Let me once again thank you for coming. And may I now turn it over to you, Martin, and express once again my deep appreciation.
Thank you very much.
I should have actually read out his CV, but I forgot. So he is one of, he's had a lot of awards, and
Interested in my CV, there is a suitably truncated version on Wikipedia. My wife's is as long, I should tell you. And if you want the full version, you can send me an email and I will send it to you. You will discover if you read it that journalists really love giving one another prizes. So Vikram did a wonderful job of introducing the topic, which I now no longer need to do. I have, of course, started off my life as an economist, a development economist. I can see colleagues, former colleagues of mine in the audience at the World Bank. And only more recent, like most people of my generation, I was born immediately after the Second World War in Britain, and by my generation in Britain or in the West, we sort of thought the question of political order had essentially been resolved. There was a crisis of the political order in the West, pretty obviously, in the interwar period. There was a crisis of global power over the same period. And by the 50s, as I grew to consciousness, it seemed perfectly clear that, as it were, the West, by which I meant the Anglo-American power, had won. The world looks obviously incredibly different today on many, many dimensions, both in terms of power, in terms of political legitimacy of systems, in terms of the economy and how we think about it. I cannot begin to discuss all that today. For that, you will have to wait for my book on this topic, which is now 3/4 finished. I'm writing the last 2 chapters. Your discussion today might well influence that. All I will say is I'm going to touch on some of the themes. I can do no more, and give an overview of some of the issues. I should stress furthermore that my discussion will be essentially entirely about my perspective from the West. The book is oriented very much to the Western world, Europe, America in particular. It has some discussion of what's going on elsewhere, but really very little. And I don't intend at this moment to use the word India even once. However, I think with a little bit of imagination, it should not be too difficult to see that some of what I say is of some relevance to the debates here. Let me just make one further introductory remark, which is important. For me, when I talk about democracy, I mean what the political scientists who talk about this refer to as liberal democracy. There's a long literature which basically means democracy combined with minority rights, individual rights, the rule of law, and therefore an independent judiciary. So that's the panoply of things. Elections are obviously a very important part of democracy, probably the defining characteristic, but while a necessary condition, they're not necessarily sufficient for what I mean when I'm talking about democracy. And by capitalism, I mean something both more and less than what many people mean by capitalism. So I just want to define it. By capitalism, I mean a system which has very extensive international commerce, international trade at least, and is therefore to a significant extent internationally integrated. I believe, and I argue that in my book, but I won't have time to do that, that international integration is a natural complement of almost any form of market system, because so much of the opportunities are cross-border. That's obviously much more important for smaller countries than big ones, but it's pretty characteristic. And I mean less than capitalism in the 19th century sense. I do not mean laissez-faire capitalism. I mean an economy whose fundamental structure consists of market exchanges and private ownership, but with a more or less substantial amount of government and social regulation. So I'm not talking about, from this point of view, what people in the 19th century or even in the last 30 years, 19th century meant by laissez-faire, or in the last 30 years meant by neoliberalism. If you want to discuss that topic, we can do so later. Now, I've got a presentation, which is over here. So, oh, it's both places. Wonderfully sophisticated. Good. I'm going to start with a few quotes, and then I'll go through what I'm going to say, and I'll do it as quickly as I can to try and finish perhaps in 25 to 30 minutes. So this, I think, sets out some of the core issues in one way. I think it's a very helpful quote. I don't agree with it entirely, but I think at core it's right. The quote is from Danny Roderick, a very well-known professor of economics at Harvard, and the quote is about 13 years old. And he basically said that our political systems and our economic systems, he was referring particularly to the West, create some very unavoidable tensions. And that's a starting point for my book. So he says democracy, national sovereignty, and global economic integration are mutually incompatible. We can combine any two of the three, but never have all three simultaneously and in full. That doesn't worry me too much, because I think life consists of trade-offs, so expecting to have anything in full is sort of ludicrous. But the fundamental point is correct. And if you want to understand the Brexit debate from here, that's really what this is about. We got involved in the EU. We discovered that to create a very deep form of economic integration in the EU, and we did, really very deep, this involved agreeing on what would historically be domestic regulatory regimes in order to get rid of all the frictions associated with crossing borders with regimes, regulatory regimes that are different. And that involved agreeing those regimes internationally, and that meant a process for doing so which overruled national sovereignty and the democratic process as perceived in member states, and that was particularly burdensome for many British people, so they have chosen to reject EU membership, which is without doubt, as Mark Carney has pointed out, our governor of our Bank of England, an act of global economic disintegration, because we were part of a very highly integrated market. We're going to leave that, and the result is barriers to trade are going to go up, and our trade will somewhat diminish. How much it will diminish, we don't know, but it will somewhat diminish. And I think that illustrates very powerfully this point. And I think part of the Indian debate, though to a very different level, since India is a highly non-globally integrated economy to this day, still reflects that. The second quote I'm going to give you, I don't know how I got there, is, I think, a very striking one, which may have, again, some resonance somewhere else. During the debate on Brexit, this was, of course, pitched as a debate between national sovereignty as decided by national democratic institutions against Europe. And in the process, it came to be accepted by many people on the Brexit side that those institutions and people who opposed the Brexit cause were traitors. And in this particular case, I don't know how familiar you are with this, in this particular case, the Daily Mail, a very well-known conservative newspaper in Britain, referred to the High Court of the UK, a very distinguished body, which ruled on a petition from a citizen that the British government could not send its letter asking for the right to leave, so-called Article 50 letter, could not send that letter without gaining parliamentary approval, which you would have thought was pretty basic in a parliamentary democracy, which of course we are. And it didn't say the government couldn't do this, it just said it needed to get parliamentary approval. It could not do this by executive fiat. And the Daily Mail, which is a highly conservative, traditional, constitutionalist paper, decided that the High Court's ruling that the British government needed to get the approval of Parliament, about whom about which institution the whole sovereignty debate was centered, that made the High Court a treacherous institution. And this, I think, is extraordinarily revealing of the state of politics. Obviously, nothing like this could happen here. Now, the final quotation is on the trade side of this discussion, and I think, again, is incredibly significant, but in a different way. And I think the emphasis on the UK and the US, which I'm giving in these quotes, is itself very revealing, because in some obvious way, I don't think I need to elaborate that, the world order that has evolved, I won't say in the last 2 centuries, but particularly in the last 70 or 80 years, was the sort of American-British order. And Donald Trump, in his inaugural address in the 20th January of 2017, included this sentence, which basically reversed quite fundamentally the American position on world trade of the previous 70-odd years. At least officially, he said protection will lead to great prosperity and strength. That's a fundamental statement about what he thought the global economic order should be like. And while there's been a long-standing debate about whether we should take Mr. Trump literally or seriously, you might be familiar with this trope, I've always said you should do both. On this issue, there's no doubt. Mr. Trump is a convinced protectionist. It's the one position he has held consistently for about 4 decades, and he means it. And what his actions have shown, he means it. And that has changed the world trade order, in my view, in a very fundamental way. So with those introductory remarks, let me just go and tell you what I'm going to cover as best I can. I'm going to talk very briefly about the relationship between capitalism and democracy. It's very shallow. I've got huge chapters on it. I'm going to talk about where we are now, which is referred to particularly by probably the world's leading scholar of democracy, Larry Diamond of Stanford and the Hoover Institution. He refers to where we are now as the democratic recession, the period of withdrawal from democracy. And that follows, as I will show you, a period of enormous advance in electoral democracy. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the globalizing economy. That's my market capitalism bit. Then I'm going to talk about the state of the advanced countries, and then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges ahead. And this will be, it's much too much to cover, and so I'm going to do it very briefly, and that will allow you to I think, have a reasonable discussion afterwards. So perhaps I can start with this chart. I'll put this chart up. I'll discuss it more at length. But the most important point to note is if you use a very standard data source, it's called Polity4. It's a very simple data source on the proportion of the world's regimes that were and are democratic. It goes back to 1800. By democratic, they mean simply one in which there's competitive elections deciding who holds power, with a large proportion, but not universal suffrage, a large proportion of the population of the country concerned engaged in that democratic process. It shows, it's not surprising, in 1800 that the proportion of democracies in the world was very simple, 0. There were none. On any reasonable definition, if you look at the red line, it's the proportion of countries in the world which have democratic constitutions. I have other charts which show the numbers. I'm sure you will all realize that in the last 50 or 60 years, 70 years, the number of countries has doubled, more than doubled actually, because of the end of the empires. So I'll leave that aside. Back in 1870, they conclude about 10% of the world's regimes were democratic. By the end of the First World War, it had risen to about 40%. Remember, that ignores the empires, obviously. That's another question altogether. There was a terrible collapse during the 20s and 30s. And then after the Second World War, democratization expanded substantially immediately after the war with the defeat of the fascist powers. There was a long period of rough status, though the number of democracies raised a lot, simply because there were far more independent countries. And then finally, from 1980 onwards, the proportion of the world's countries that were democratic exploded. This was the great period of democratic expansion, the fall of the Soviet Union, the transformation of many autocracies into democracies was a period for people like me of tremendous optimism. And then finally, it shows this only goes up to about 8 years ago, a stasis, and as I'll show you in a minute, a decline. And interestingly, though I don't have the time to go to it in detail, there's quite a high correlation. In fact, really, I've found, to my mind, surprisingly high correlation between the periods of democratic advance and the periods of globalization, measured here quite simply by the rising ratio of trade to GDP. And I argue that this is probably an interactive process, though there are separate forces going along. In particular, the periods of globalization tended to be periods, both cause and effect, of relative prosperity and optimism. And when the global economy collapsed, as in the Great Depression, that you can see the trade collapsed in the Great Depression and it stabilized after the financial crisis. People seem to have got increasing doubt about existing political institutions. Protectionism rose and democracy eroded. They seem to go together. And the most striking example of that, of course, was the 30s when democratic regimes collapsed almost everywhere where countries were sovereign. So what a little bit more about the relationship between democracy and the capitalism. I basically argue that there are both mutually supportive and mutually conflicting aspects of this complex relationship between our economic and political systems. The supportive aspects are the basic, to me, the most fundamental ones, is both democracy and the market starts off from the assumption that you've moved away in large measure from ascribed status societies. You've moved towards a society in which individuals have political rights and economic rights, rights to offer their labor, to create businesses, and rights to participate in political society, irrespective of their social status. In this sense, they're both egalitarian. The difference only is democracy applies to where we make collective decisions. Economic rights apply predominantly, though not exclusively, to where we make decisions on our own or in private organizations about about how the economy should work and our own role in it. And I also argue that in the West, though it was a very painful and long-term process, very complicated one, the development of the market economy, both directly and interestingly indirectly, created forces demanding and leading to massive demands for democracy. And of these, I think the most important was the move towards universal education, which was a necessary part of the development of the economy in the 19th century. Every major developed countries moved towards universal literacy in the 19th century. And the other one was the creation of an urban economy within mass industrialization and organized labor. And again, organized labor became a powerful interest group, repeatedly demanding universal suffrage. So as a byproduct of the market system, the demands for democratization became universal, and ultimately the logic of individual rights extended to everybody, including, of course, every woman by the early part of the 20th century. Nonetheless, there are profound tensions between the market and democracy, and that's true on at least two very profound dimensions. The first is, by its nature, democracy is confined, essentially confined, to a political system, a political jurisdiction, which is territorially defined. That's what a country is. It's a territorially defined political jurisdiction within which democracy applies, and obviously doesn't apply abroad. While the market system operates pretty naturally and powerfully across borders, as I've already indicated that here. So there's a mismatch, as Danny says, between the border, the confines within which the political order operates and the confines within which the market order operates, and that's a permanent structural tensions. And the other fact, which is of course quite evident, is that a market, which I'll come to later, is that a market order tends to generate quite naturally, quite normally, very substantial inequalities of economic wealth, and those inequalities of economic wealth inevitably tend also to be reflected in political power, and that is seen as, and indeed in some obvious sense is, corrosive of the democratic idea of equality, and that's another of the permanent tensions. So I see democracy and the market system as being both mutually supportive and in opposition. It's a very complicated relationship, and I didn't really understand that before. I took the democracy side for granted, but that's how I see it now. Now, that allows me to turn to where we are now, which is the democratic recession. I think because, for reasons that I'm going to come to in a little while, focusing on the developed countries, these negative aspects of the relationship have become more significant, partly because the economy hasn't been performing very well for many people. And in that context, anger about existing structure of society and existing political and economic relations becomes quite natural, and you start moving into a new political arena, a political era, and I think the dominant characteristic of this new era is what we call populism, which I will come to in a moment. So this is from Freedom House. It divides countries of the world from 1988 to 2018 into what they call free, which we would say is just basically democratic, liberal democratic, partly free and not free. And the major point I wanted to make is that after a very substantial rise in the proportion of the world's countries that were free between 88 and 98, a lot of it to do to the fall of the Soviet Union. It stabilized between then and 2008 and fell modestly, but the proportion of the countries that they define as not free, which is autocratic, rose significantly. It's not a massive reversal, but this is the first significant reversal in the proportion of countries that are democratic for more than half a century. So it's not an insignificant development in my view. And the second feature of this chart, which I think is very striking, since Freedom House is an American organization, very much reflecting American values, in 2018 it assessed the state of democracy, and I don't have the time to go into the various dimensions of what it meant to be a liberal democracy. That's what they were evaluating at that time, and I've just put the chart here for the major Western countries, including Japan here as an honorary Western country. What else to come and do for this purpose? But a really striking feature, and that would not have been the case a few years earlier, is the US is far and away the worst. On a number of dimensions, I could go into them: electoral, gerrymandering, the role of money in politics and so forth. Freedom House itself feels that democracy in the United States, the bellwether of the democratic order, has been eroding. So that's where we are. A huge expansion of democracy over centuries, a massive expansion in the proportion of democratic regimes from 1978 onwards, rough 1980 onwards, and now we're well into a democratic recession with particularly worrying signs in some major bellwether countries, particularly and crucially the US. Now let me talk about the economy. I'm going to start by what, because as I've already suggested, I think the corrosion of the democratic system is partly related to economic development, so that's what I'm going to talk about. Anyway, I'm an economist, so I tend to talk about economics. And one of the most interesting things that has happened, which is, I think, captured in this chart, I could have given oodles of others. I've gone for global nominal GDP. The same picture basically emerges at purchasing power parity. I use this because most of the audiences I talk to don't understand what purchasing power parity is. Obviously, that wouldn't be true here. But one of the most interesting points to bear in mind is that the last era of full-on globalization in economics, the era of the late 19th, early 20th century, also, of course, the era of empire, ended in large part because of massive shifts in global economic power associated with that globalizing era, which were also, of course, massive shifts in global power. Particularly, of course, the rise of Germany and the rise of the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century, and the erosion of British hegemony, which is completely obvious. We're seeing exactly the same thing now. So this period of globalization has in particular been associated with, and this is the main point this chart makes, with a massive shift in global economic power from the West, which are the West and its allies, the advanced countries, that's basically the Western system, which was overwhelmingly dominant in 1994, and by 2024, and indeed already by 2019, has lost about 20 percentage points of its relative position. It's still far and away the biggest economic system in the world, but it's much, much smaller. And the difference has been made up about 80% roughly by China, and the rest by India. India is immediately above. And the rise of China is obviously both a consequence of, fascinating consequence of the globalizing era, and of course, it goes without saying, and I'll come to this in a minute, China has not democratized to the slightest degree. So that's a very important geopolitical and economic effect, explaining, in my view, part of the democratic recession. Because a lot of my work is for the my work is on this is for Western audiences, I like to stress that this globalizing economy order had some extraordinary achievements to its credit. I think Surjit would agree with this one, which is a quite staggering reduction in extreme poverty over this period. This is World Bank data. I know Surjit has considerable doubts about World Bank data, but it's the only one I have. So this is the poverty headcount ratio, 2011 purchasing power parity, the World Bank's extreme poverty measure. The important thing to remember is that back in 1820 or so, basically 90% of humanity were in this state. Extreme destitution, on the borderline of subsistence, and the population since then has expanded sevenfold, roughly. The major point is that between 1981 and 2014, I think the last year, is the poverty headcount worldwide fell from almost 45% to 10%. There's been no comparable period in world history that we know of in which poverty is reduced at this rate. So this is a tremendous achievement. When we talk about the neoliberal order and all its crimes, I think we should remember that. Much of this, well, it's all China and India, essentially. The biggest chunk is China, but also a significant change in this dimension in India. The gains from this globalization era, and this is the last two charts I'm going to discuss here because I think they're very relevant to the problems we have, are very fascinating. So this is what I'm showing you in the next two charts is a decomposition, for those of you who are familiar with it, of Branko Milanovic's famous elephant chart, which shows the changes in changes in real income, proportionate changes in real income by percentile of the global income distribution. There are lots of problems with this, but it's still, I think, a very illuminating way of looking at what's happened. And it goes from the period 1980 to, so the first period is 1980, and the second period is 2016. And what it shows is the bottom half of the global income distribution has actually, in terms of proportionate increases in income, done very well. Real incomes of the bottom half of the global income distribution have risen between about, this starts at the 10th decile, it's the first decile, after the first decile. So the very poor haven't increased much. Beyond that, they've increased between 80% and 120% up to the beginning of the 5th decile, and even 60% up to the beginning of the fifth decile, so the sixth decile. So half the global income distribution had really rather large gains. That's comparable with the poverty, consistent with the poverty distribution. But the rest of the income distribution, which basically consists of middle income people in the developed world and somewhat higher income people in countries like the former Soviet Empire and Latin America, have done relatively much worse. Substantially declines, not declines, there are no declines in their income on average, but much, much smaller proportionate gains relative to those at the bottom. Meanwhile, as you sort of probably saw before, let me just go back one. As you get towards the the top decile of the global income distribution, gains are rising more and more. And when you keep going through the top 1% of the world, with each subsequent subdivision of the top 1% in the world, the gains get bigger and bigger and bigger. So essentially, if you look at global income growth, the really big winners have been the bottom half of the world and the top 1%. I think that's a really rather striking fact. According to these figures, which are debatable, roughly a quarter of the increase in global income, real incomes, between 1980 and the most recent data accrued to the global top 1%. Okay, let me move on now to what's happened to the developed countries. During this era, a number of significant economic changes occurred in the developed countries, which tended to be seen as particularly unwelcome by people in the bottom half, roughly speaking, of the income distribution. I don't have the time to go into the cultural aspects of these shifts. There are very profound ones, but some of these changes are very striking. So the first one, which I point out, is, though this varied to a significant extent, this shows the proportion of the foreign-born as a share of population between 2000 and 2016. The ability of countries to cope with this shift varied massively. Some did much better than others. But you can see that there has been a very, very large increase in immigration in quite a range of countries, often countries that were historically exporters of people. And this has raised the issue of immigration to the front rank of political discourse in almost every developed country, and it has uniformly favored right populists. So that's the first really big political economic development. I don't have the time to discuss why countries with relatively small increases have much more political saliency of this. It's a very, very important issue. I just don't have time to go into it. The second big change, which was really very important for the developed countries' political structure, particularly given the role that I've already stressed of mass unionization and organization of the labor force, is the scale of deindustrialization. So this shows the proportion of industrial employment ranked by where they were in 1970 across the major developed countries. In industry, in share of employment in industry. These were, back in the 1960s, in most Western countries, half the labor force was in industry, obviously overwhelmingly male, mostly overwhelmingly semi-skilled or fairly unskilled, stable employment, relatively high income, high levels of natural protection, and this has collapsed. Basically everywhere. With it has gone the decline of trade unions, very large shifts in relative incomes for relatively unskilled people, and it's had very powerful local effects because these large factories tended to dominate the employment of particular towns. There's lots of very interesting literature on that. Interestingly, while trade is obviously a significant factor, it's very far from the only one. Probably the most important single one is the progress, massive progress, of automation in factories. In fact, we can foresee now a world in which pretty well all factories will consist of robot-run plants. So that's industrial. The third factor, which I think is incredibly important, in what's happened to the developed countries is the collapse of productivity growth. So this shows the average growth of output per hour in these economies starting in the 1950s. I won't go into all the detail, but the essential point is, particularly since the financial crisis, the 2010s is the green block, but also to some extent in the previous decade, productivity growth has fallen to very low levels. There's an immense debate about why this has happened, which I can't go into now, but the essential consequence, inevitable consequence is that average real incomes are growing at exceptionally low rates by historical standards. And since income distribution has also worsened in a number of countries, that means quite significant proportions of the population, in my view, have been experiencing very low growth in household disposable incomes and real incomes. This shows what's happened to the shares of the top 10% of income recipients in pre-tax national income, just a small fragment. And you can see that pretty well across the board, there's been a significant rise in this share of income. In some cases, like the US, UK, Japan, even Germany, these rises are really very large relative to income. In the US today, according to this database, in pre-tax income, the share of the top 10% in the income distribution is equal to that of the next, of the entire bottom 6 deciles. Okay, I think that was the figure. An important factor now much discussed is the impact of inequality on social mobility. There are obvious reasons why higher inequality would tend to lower social mobility. This is the person who's best known for work in this is a Canadian economist called Miles Korak. This shows the correlation between the Gini coefficient, which is a very crude measure of inequality, and social mobility defined as the proportion of a son's income, which is relative income, which is determined by his father's relative income. The reason the focus on the father is that this goes back to the very early 80s when it's still a relatively small proportion of women were in the labor force, particularly more educated women. We would now obviously do this differently. The major point that is made here is the more unequal the higher the Gini coefficient, the lower social mobility tends to be. The more the one's relative position in the income distribution is determined by what one's father's position was. And you can see that with the US and UK as clear outliers. And then I think this is finally the extraordinary shock of the financial crisis on a wide number of developed countries. So what this chart does is show the deviation from the 1980-2007 trend growth of GDP per head since the crisis in 2007. So if you look down the left-hand side, the percentages show the proportionate decline in that, the decline relative to trend, essentially except for Germany. All developed countries, and in some cases dramatically so, GDP per head is vastly below the pre-crisis trend. That's particularly dramatic for Spain and Italy, which had huge crises, but is also very striking for the UK and US. Since the financial crisis was an unexpected event, nobody understands, as it were, why this has happened, or it's not been politically explained, but most people are very, very well aware that when the crisis happened, the entire financial system was saved, and they weren't. Many experienced the consequences of the subsequent recession and fiscal austerity. It created an immense amount of resentment, I think, which was there to be captured by new politicians, new elites, arguing that the old elites had betrayed the people, and I think was an important aspect of the rise of resentment. So let me now talk briefly about where we are politically, and that will be the end of it. When I think of the rise of populism, I think of two dimensions, two ways of thinking about it. Two ideologies. One is what I call populism light, which is a characteristic of pretty well all our politics nowadays. It's anti-elitist and it despises experts. And we've seen a lot of that across the entire Western world. A much more profound form of populism is anti-pluralist. That is to say, it emphasizes majority rights against the other rights associated with liberal democracy, and it emphasizes the idea that so long as a leader is elected, that leader is entitled to act pretty well as he wishes. And this is very clearly the political ideology of Donald Trump, and it's the political ideology of quite a number of the leaders. Orban is another example, plenty of others, who have won elections and take the view that they are allowed, as a result of that, to do pretty well what they like, as long as they have majority support. Orban calls this illiberal democracy, and that's a form of what I call populism heavy, and of course it's very close to outright autocracy. And when Vikram was talking about the march of more autocratic systems, I think that's basically what he's referring to. So that's the first big thing that we're seeing. We're seeing it across the West, not just outside the West, and it seems to be a new form of, not a new form, it's a restoration, a return of an old form of politics with very profound significance for the operations of our societies and our political systems. The second big change that I think has emerged is what I think of as the multiple kinds of capitalism model. And here Branko Milanovic has a point. He basically says, if we think about the future of economic systems, they're all going to be capitalist because nobody really, really believes in socialism anymore. Not after all, even the Chinese, as it were, think where they were half a century ago. But the sort of capitalism you have can vary rather dramatically. And he suggests the distinction is essentially between democratic capitalism and autocratic capitalism. Well, I thought about this some more, and I've decided that's not quite subtle enough distinction. So I'm going to suggest, without any discussing it anymore, that we're actually seeing competitions between 5 types of capitalism today. And you can decide where you all are. So there's the unique phenomenon of what I call Communist Party capitalism, which you have to admit is somewhat surreal. What I think of as gangster capitalism. And the most fully developed gangster capitalist state in the world, in my view, is Russia. Paternalist hierarchical capitalism, rather successful, Japan, South Korea, Singapore. Free market, quote unquote, I can explain this later, Pluto-populist capitalism, which is the US, in which plutocracy is allied to populism in a truly fascinating way. And finally, social democratic capitalism, EU, Canada, Australia, and UK, which is very much under stress. So I think the way to think about our political economic systems in future, I suggest, is as a competition between different forms of capitalist political systems. And there are quite a number of them. And what we don't know at the moment is which is going to work best, because we are really in a time, I think, of upheaval in our sense of how capitalism and the political system should evolve. Let me just close, I know I've run over a little, but not so dramatically, I hope, with some other aspects of the world that will affect this competition between capitalist systems in this post-crisis era. First, just to look at US protection against Chinese exports. The pink is what might happen if the trade deal doesn't work, which is quite likely. I mean, basically what you're seeing here is the US reversing, and it has not result from this, clearly reversing the most significant economic aspect of the globalization era, which was the integration of the US and China. The US is clearly trying to reverse the integration of the US and China. I think we're at a very early stage in that, and that is going to have profound significance for everybody in the global order. And one of the things I'm trying to suggest here is what happens in democratic, domestic politics is profoundly influenced by what happens in the global order. The second aspect of this is this has now become a global security competition. We are back to the pre-First World War and pre-Second World War era and the Cold War era with a major global security competition. This shows the military spendings as a percent of world total in real terms. It's done at PPP between, if you like, the Western system and the Chinese-Russian system. In 2000, the Western system after the Cold War was overwhelmingly dominant. As you can see, the relative size of the blue bloc and the pink and red bloc. It's still dominant. The US is still overwhelmingly the world's dominant security power, but China is expanding at colossal speed and becoming a great military power. There's no doubt about it. And that is, again, these arms races that are characteristic of global order breakdowns historically. And the final issue, just to stress, which I know is much an issue here, there is this big overarching theme of the need for global cooperation to deal with climate change, and this is what has happened to global average temperature vis-a-vis pre-industrial period in the last 100 years, and it's continuing to rise, and people are getting very agitated. So while the global order is falling apart and our domestic politics are becoming increasingly fraught, we want a hell of a lot more global cooperation, which is rather difficult to achieve. So, my conclusion, it's a world in profound upheaval in terms of domestic politics and international relations. Those are related to what has happened to the global economic system over the last 40 or 50 years. Global capitalism promoted democracy, a reduction in global inequality, as I pointed out, and a huge shift in global power. It was, in other words, a revolutionary force, but it also promoted shocks inside high-income countries, and in my view, the financial crisis was related to that. I've written another book about it. The challenge now is to protect liberal democracy from the more extreme forms of populism, what I call populism heavy, cope with the rise of China, manage that peacefully, and manage the global commons at the same time. And this will require, in my view, an extensive rebalancing of the capitalist system and democracy across the world, and that's the challenge we all face. Thank you for listening.
Hello, can you hear? Yeah. Great. So thank you, Martin, for that. It was very comprehensive. It went beyond globalization, the common public goods that we're talking about. The story actually strings along rather well when we think of the OECD countries. And yet we are sitting in that part of the world which has gained, continues to gain tremendously from globalization. So the question that I will pose to the discussants today, and I'll begin with you, Pratap, where do you see the reflection from emerging markets, particularly let's talk about India and China, because even the definitions of democracy, as he did in the beginning, I'm not sure India adopted democracy because of any capitalist tendencies, and China refuses to do it despite capitalist gains. So how do you see this getting extrapolated to this part of the world?
So let's have some fun. Let me disagree with Martin a little bit about the West first, because more by way of adding nuance. It's not fundamentally a disagreement. As I see it, there are actually two puzzles about this particular moment of democratic recension. And let's first stipulate what we mean by democratic recension, the two attributes that Martin powerfully identified. One is rising authoritarianism, rise of executive power, repression of civil liberties, those kinds of things happening in places from Hungary, Poland, the decline of institutions. And the second is the rise of majoritarianism as an aspect of civil rights, right? Now, one of the, I think, deep puzzles about this moment is that typically when democratic recensions took place, so anybody remember Sam Huntington, Political Order in Changing Societies, right? The argument used to be that democratic recessions take place when two things happen. Either there are countries with particular configurations of civil-military relationship. So if Pakistan has a democratic recession, we kind of know there's an institutional history of military involvement, or if Egypt has it, right? Or, and that was the second point, democratic recession happens when there is a challenge from below, social mobilization, and the elites of that society who want to preserve that capitalist order or whatever actually want to repress it, right? And his argument was social mobilization should never exceed the institutional capacity you have, because that's when democratic recession takes place. To me, one of the puzzles of this moment is actually the authoritarianism happened on the wave of an immense political demobilization. It's not like, if you look at the strike to lockout, and I'm talking about the democratic world. I think China is an interesting contrast. If you look at strikes to lockout ratios, if you look at student movement and mobilization, all the characteristics of popular mobilization, they were completely absent before elites decided to go out and repress them, right? The rise of executive power in the US, for example, the curtailment of civil liberties. This is not the 60s. That, you know, there's an elite trying to clamp down. This is not Pinochet trying to create way for neoliberalism against a socialist mobilization, right? So I think there's something more sui generis about this authoritarianism. And I think one way of looking at it is just even looking at Europe. Poland, one of the most successful integrators into the EU, did remarkably well, has recession outcomes exactly like Hungary. A different puzzle, Spain, one of the worst performers in the EU, actually doesn't have as deep a democratic recession as you think, right? So I think one of the puzzles to think about at this moment is whether this is actually as overdetermined a structural capitalism democracy story as we think, or is this about particular configurations and political choices? I think China is an interesting example because as we are talking about the democratic recession, let's also talk about authoritarian recession. 2 or 3 years ago, we were discussing things like smart authoritarianism, right? Somehow have authoritarian countries evolved a model that requires somewhat less repression and can function, you know, effectively. China was the prime example of that. Let's not forget, all authoritarianisms have had to up their clamping down. Although in their case, there is some evidence that it is against social mobilization. That Xi Jinping was not just worried about mobilization against corruption, so you preempt that. But if you look at, for example, data on labor strikes in China, right? China has much more of the characteristics of what the 1970s mobilization had, against which the state needed to repress. So I actually think there is a little bit more, at least I'm more puzzled by this story than it being simply a democracy capitalism story. I mean, I think that's in the background. I'll just say one more thing and then stop for a moment. The second thing, which I think more from an emerging developing country point, which I think is something that Martin powerfully articulated, but I think its full implications we need to stress out. So one of the arguments that is being made about, you know, inequality has always existed. Capitalism and democracy have had this relationship, can't live without each other, can't live with each other. There have been ups and downs. But one of the things that characterizes this moment in terms of inequality, right, is what Daniel Markovits says, inequality even in the Western world has acquired more caste-like characteristics. Okay? What does that mean? And this, I mean, everybody who's writing has given evidence with it, Markovits, Branko, Milanovic. So the first thing you notice is that human capital tracks wealth much more than it ever did in the past, right? Both of those things track assortive mating, marriage choices, much more than in the past. I mean, what, you know, the intergenerational mobility, lack of that Martin in a sense referred to, right? Those things track certain kinds of cultural privileges, geographical locations, and urbanization fast, right? So one of the interesting things is that in the traditional way we used to think about capitalism and inequality, we used to focus a lot on kind of income inequality. But the social contract used to be income inequality is okay so long as other forms of opportunity are somewhat insulated, right? So educational opportunity is somewhat insulated from wealth, political opportunity is somewhat insulated from wealth. But it's the acquisition of inequality of these caste-like characteristics, right? Now, those are often a product of specific policy choices, right? So for example, education, which used to be the instrument of intergenerational mobility, or marriage, which used to be the second instrument of intergenerational mobility. Now both are working in the opposite direction, right? It's really, which is why there is a populist revolt against universities, elitism, and intellectuals, right? That's a new phenomenon. If you look at, for example, even the evolution of capitalism, so one of the things I'd love to hear Martin say a little bit more about, you nicely delineated these 5 different models of capitalism in terms of, I think, their political characteristics, which is a politically corrupt, which is crony. But the more interesting problem for Western democracies, right, is in the late 70s, in response to a previous generation of crises and social mobilization, Western capitalism underwent a transformation in 3 different ways, right? One, greater financialization, which acquired an autonomous life of its own. Second, a de-emphasis on the state's role and state's institution. You need strong regulatory institutions for capitalism. You always needed strong industrial policy for innovation and technology and productivity. Right? So that whole kind of Thatcherite Reagan moment of the state withdrawing, at least in ideological terms. But third and more significantly, right, vast changes even in the way in which we began to think of ownership of assets within capitalist societies, right? So you can, for example, the older distinction used to be, is shareholder capitalism better than owner-driven capitalism, right? The way, for example, taxation policies are structured, which were largely now structured to benefit certain asset classes more than other asset classes. So these are specific policy choices that changed even the configuration of ownership and returns within established capitalist democracies. And I just wonder whether, by focusing too much on capitalism with, in a sense, a big C and with all these structures, we actually somehow miss out the specific question, which is, what was it about forms of democratic mobilization that actually allowed those kinds of changes in the ownership of capital, even within advanced democracies, to actually take place? I mean, now there's a little bit of discussion about pushing back against shareholder capitalism, for example, whether it actually impedes innovation. Intellectual property rights, right? Another good example, huge evidence that it certainly impedes innovation in, for example, the pharmaceutical industry, contrary to what economic theory led us to believe, right? So underlying this big shift that Martin is talking about is actually almost a change in our kind of cognitive map about what forms of ownership actually produce innovation and productivity. And I wonder whether we need to break open that box a little bit in terms of the kinds of choices the US made. And then, of course, everybody else follows. Because that will then give us some space to say, okay, where can democracy actually intervene, right? In actually fixing this story, or at least mitigating it somewhat.
So it's about choices, the choices that have led to this. In fact, incidentally, yesterday Deutsche Bank put out statistics on even though within the OECD country, what's the exposure to China. And given coronavirus, each of them is now preparing a strategy. And amongst the OECD countries, it's actually China. It's the US which has the highest exposure. France, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium are actually quite isolated in that sense. So some of the, so the policy implications now we are seeing under Trump for instance, could also be just that, that within the OECD countries, there are very different, there's a huge variation. Talking about averages, Mrs. Oust. Surjit, do you agree with Martin broadly, and what implications do you think does it have for the emerging markets?
Martin is always stimulating, always has content that one thinks about. And I would say that over the last 30, 40 years that I've known him, we broadly agree on about 90-95%. So let me give that, and then I'll come to the disagreements as such.
Let's talk about the other 5%.
Yeah. So I want to first make 3 broad points in which to understand, from my vantage point, what is happening in the world. I'm not saying either of the 2 speakers don't see it the same way or similar ways, but I just want to put it in my own words, and then go to some specifics. The first very important point from my perspective is that the elite in the world has expanded in an unprecedented manner. Poverty has reduced in an unprecedented manner. The elites have expanded in an unprecedented manner. Now, we all grew up and were elite when there was a very small fraction of our own country or the world that was elite. Now we have a lot of competition. And I think that is one battle going on in the world, the old elite versus the new elite, that I think provides an important perspective on what is happening. Second, which is very much related to the first, the education, which Martin also mentioned, has also expanded in an unprecedented fashion. And these are all interlinked, and we should give due importance to that. These are, and you add the third, which is the information revolution, or the mobile revolution, and you get a huge, humongous strides towards equality, whether in the developing world or in the developed world. Now I'll come to some specific data issues. I went through Martin's PowerPoint presentation, and I'll start with the most obvious, which is used by everybody, about inequality in the US and the top 1% and how the billionaires have expanded and all the rest of it. First, very important, and Martin was very precise, that he was talking about pre-tax inequality in the US. Look, we can't have democratic capitalism or anything without looking at post-tax, because tax is a very important part of the modern world, and whether you redistribute through tax or not is a very important part of the modern world, especially of the West. There is Piketty cited, and which is pre-tax. If you look at, there has been some recent literature, Aetna, etc., which shows Piketty has that pre-tax income in the US of the top 1% went up from 10% to 22%, which is a humongous increase. Well, if you look at post-tax, it went up from 10 to 13, okay? Which most of us would not think of a revolution. Matter of fact, that's what is financing the emergence of the new elite, which has emerged. Also, an interesting feature of the Piketty data, and regarding India, in 2005, in the World Bank Economic Review, there's a paper by Abhijit Banerjee, Nobel Prize winner, and Thomas Piketty on top Indian incomes. And there is the World Inequality database, which the world is now using in order to derive all kinds of conclusions. Very interesting feature. In the Banerjee-Piketty paper for India, income inequality of the top 1%, etc., was almost identical to consumption inequality in India. Consumption inequality and top Piketty inequality in 1998. Very strangely, for 1998, the India data in the World Inequality Database has become much more unequal. How in 1998, nothing has changed in 2015 about 1998 inequality, and by the same author, the numbers are radically different. We are now much more unequal in 1998 than we thought we were according to the same authors, or according to one of the same authors. So I think the data issue is rather important in this, because if we derive conclusions based on that, then we need to properly account for whether the data are correct. One more point about protection and increased move towards protection, and US being the prime example. And you know, I'm with Martin and all my economist colleagues. I mean, I guess we were trained from, we were, you know, bred on that protection is bad. And we all agree with protection is bad. And I also, even today, agree with protection is bad. But I want to ask, what is the difference between the new protection in the US and the sophisticated protection, which is deep undervaluation of the exchange rate, which China practiced for 30 years, and which all the liberal economists applauded? Where were we when the lights went out? And it's not a coincidence, in my view, that the US is the one reacting the most to China. US welcomed China before. US firms welcomed China before. They made their profits or didn't make their profits is immaterial. But that protection, so when we denounce the US, as we should, for its protection today, we should also mention the protection of China. Last, and then we can go on, the authoritarian clampdown, etc. Look, because of the information revolution, it was much easier to clamp down on dissent. It's a lot more difficult now. So they are using the tools that you have today. In the olden days, you didn't need to read the tools because you could do it and nobody would know. So we need to have a perspective. Look, how much has the world changed? How much has the elite changed? How much has the authority, the rulers, changed? Or is it that they are using the tools that the old authoritarians used, the tools that were most relevant for them, and the new authoritarians are using the most tools that are most relevant to them?
Thank you. So, Martin, basically, to sum up Surjit's main criticism, I think the comment on this story would be that there are lots of nuances or details in the data itself, right? I mean, even Freedom House, for instance, these are mostly indices. Now, traditionally, economies, we've had tremendous problem with indices because of the way they are structured. Are they truly capturing the kind of profound changes we are?
My criticism goes far beyond Arvind Subramanian's rather narrow.
Yes, but let's stick to the democracy and the dissent.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, the recession of that and so on. Not economic recession, we're talking democratic recession. It's more a data, it's more nuance, it's more about the way we are measuring things that the story might not quite hold if we actually got into the accuracy. While Pratap is telling us that we should really look at the policy choices themselves that have led us to the situation that these have not been random events, they have actually been outcome of deliberate policy instruments that these OECD countries have made. So your response to them?
So many issues have been raised, and of course my discussion in my here was probably crazy, but I'm just a reduced form of an immense amount of material. So let me focus on what I think is really important. First of all, is there a democratic recession? which is the question you raise, or is it just an artifact of measurement? Well, democracy, the health of a democracy is clearly not a 1-0 state. I mean, there are ones and zeros. I suppose you probably agree Denmark is fairly close to 1 and North Korea is fairly close to 0. But between that, there are a very large number of variations. And one of the characteristics of the political changes of our time in the societies I know about, which are basically Western, are quite subtle. And since a liberal democratic system is a complex array of institutions and institutional relations, it inevitably, assessing where you're moving in when it's moving, involves trying, if you're trying to put it in numbers, putting numbers on rather subtle movements. So we're going to always disagree on measurement. I think that's absolutely clear until you have moved somewhere completely new. The second point, which I think is a much deeper and more interesting one, which I think might partly relink to Pratap's questions about how we saw how we saw the development of dictatorship in particular, is authoritarianism might be a better word, it's a broader one, is that historically, in the recent past, by which I mean the post-Second World War era, most of what happened in most places were coups. You knew what had happened because the one was a sort of democratic regime and the zero was military. What is interesting about what has been happening, and I don't think there's much doubt that that's what's been happening in many countries, is that there has been it's moved at different speeds, erosion of certain sorts of institutional autonomies, usually starting with the courts. And that's the most obvious feature of it, as assault on the courts, which have the characteristic conflicts over who should be judges, over the loyalties of judges, who decides who judges should be. All this is quite difficult to define. The courts are still there, no institution has ever changed. And I have this favorite example, which is why this is so difficult, which is, to me, because I was a classicist once upon a time, ancient world, is that when the Roman Republic died and was replaced by the empire, no institution changed. Not one institution changed. But it was a move from the Republic to the empire. So I do think that it is the characteristic of glacial shifts to autocracy, and you've seen some very remarkable examples of this. Turkey is probably the most significant one I know about. It occurs without at any stage a point in which you can say it's happened. And I do think membership is very... so I think you do have to be quite nuanced. All I would say from what I see is there are a lot of countries in which things like this, which are quite similar, seem to be occurring, the characteristic. There's a technology here, by which I mean a social and political technology at work, which certain sorts of leaders understand. And it seems to me consistent with the broad, crude measures you're getting from Polity4 and from Freedom House, that this is where we're moving. The other question Pratap raised, of course, is why? And I think, I was looking for I can't go into all of this, but I think there is a real puzzle and an argument against my position, which is that it seems to me in Britain and America, it is pretty easy to identify that there have been very, very substantial, socially significant losers who have mobilized behind very specific sorts of politicians to rectify, as they see, their economic and social position. I stress both. What's been going on in emerging economies, and here I'm including Eastern Europe, it does seem to me interestingly different. So the question that I have in mind, it's a genuine question, is are we seeing journeys to the same outcomes but actually for somewhat different reasons, which I think is perfectly plausible. And is the outcome really what is driving this? For a very simple reason, that certain very, very talented political entrepreneurs who share an understanding of how to do this. How to do this was really invented in the interwar period, dramatically so in Italy. Never underestimate the influence of Mussolini on the world. So anyway, there's a question. I think it's a really important and interesting question. I don't want to get involved in the immense debates on US data, except to say that I think the inequality point, to my mind, is, to me, though not entirely insignificant, is much less important than the other characteristics of what has happened. I know this is also controversial in terms of real incomes, relative real incomes, real incomes, real household incomes, and the general collapse of productivity growth, which has had such a significant effect on the average incomes of everybody. In the UK case, which is the one obviously I know best, and there's no doubt about it, basically household real incomes have stagnated now for 13 years. As far as we know, this hadn't happened since the early 19th century. So this is a rather significant change in a social order which was built around the assumption that in normal times you just get richer. That's what is supposed to happen. I know I've taken much too much. There's so many other enormous issues. I'm not going to go into the exchange rate issue in China. By the way, as Sujit surely knows, I read quite a bit about that problem 15 years ago, and I've always been on his side on the exchange rate issue. But I think we would have to agree that in the last if you're right, one of the ironies of what's been going on is that the Chinese stopped that policy more or less 3 or 4 years before Trump decided to pursue them. So this is one of the most extraordinarily ill-timed interventions in that sense, and of course completely futile. But anyway, I've covered at least a few of the questions.
Okay, let's take, now we'll take a few questions. Mics, please. And just keep your comments to question, and if you could tell us who is it addressed to?
This is to Martin. I'm Mudit Kapoor from Indian Statistical Institute. You didn't talk about social media and democracy. I think this is a big platform being provided to demagogues and all sorts of people who believe in propaganda. So could these compete out the kind of democracy which is not basically a rule of majoritarian? So I worry that this is a new change in the 2000s, which I think was not covered. Maybe it's covered in the book. And it bothers me because Montesquieu and other philosophers have always worried about majoritarianism, right from the founding fathers of the US Constitution until date. I think this is a big change that needs to be discussed. Thank you.
Okay, let's collect a few, if that's okay. Yes, Leila?
Thank you very much for this imitative talk. I'm Leila from IDB. You didn't talk about nationalism and mercantilism. I believe actually China is a combination of mercantilism plus nationalism. And you also find that the US make America great, that's nationalism. You also hear anti-national in India. So the nationalism, although you might take it as a populism, but for me, populism is different from nationalism. And in China, the communism basically is in the close of communism, but it's basically nationalism. It's the result after the Second World War of all those developing countries became independent. And it might have a quite different perspective because, as you said, capitalism, they are more or less all capitalism, but nationalism, they may compete with each other. National. Then it might be we go back to before the Second World War. Thanks.
Nilanjana. Suman, and then we'll go to
Thanks, Suman Berry. I guess this question is both to Martin and to the two panelists. So your Danny Roderick quote, Martin, essentially leads in his argumentation to the idea that basically countries should be allowed flexibility in choosing, as it were, the globalization regime, I find a lot of pushback on this idea when I'm in Europe, on the grounds that this would lead to anarchy in the global order. How do you reconcile, as it were, the Roderick point of view with the concept of a rules-based order? And my questions to Sujit and Pratap would then be that, is that really what we see the Indian government up to, trying to create the space for, as it were, a version of global integration that is, if you like, specific to the Indian political culture?
Thank you, Yogendra Kumar. Actually, this is rather a question and a comment. I think when you talk about the inequality and the fact that these kind of developments have been so jerky and messy in that sense, I think one important aspect, in my view, is the fact that the political parties themselves, in all these countries, whether US or UK or wherever, they actually are getting corroded from within. So they're losing the internal resilience and internal culture of democracy, because of which the inequality, which actually gets compensated by the fact that ordinary people get a sense of empowerment through the participation through the political parties. Now, all that actually has really malfunctioned. And that's why this transformation, the transition has taken place. They have not been handled well by the elites, because they are in a find themselves situation when they get entrusted and the distance between them and the wider population actually grows. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 4 questions now. Martin, we'll start with you, and then Sujit and Pratap.
Did you say mercantilism and nationalism?
Yes.
Okay, just to make sure that I understood. Okay, I thought these were wonderful questions. One of the things I've learned, I started writing this thing about, I realized this was a really big issue about 2015. I started in 2015 and then 2016, and I'm now at the end. And one of the things I've realized is no sane person would try to write political economy now, because the literature is vastly too great. And so I was really thinking people like Karl Marx had it easy. No, there are many other differences. But it's fantastically difficult to write on these topics, partly because they're simply so massive, and partly because one's perspective is so very much driven by one's own intellectual background. So I started as an economist, and I look at it that way. And that may be a terrible mistake, but I'm not sure there's anyone on the other side, Pratap can comment, who could handle all the economic stuff. So I think we're a terrible problem in discussing this, because we're all too specialized. This is a sort of general remark. Okay, that's related to social media. Yes, of course, there's a section in the book on this. And this is where I am at the moment. And I'm open to persuasion that I'm completely wrong. I've read a lot of literature on this. Of course, there is a huge literature on it. I am somewhat skeptical, and I think this goes against Sujit's view, of the overwhelming significance of this invention compared with where we were 60 or 70 or 80 years ago. And but my actual real difference actually links with your question. I think the party change is a bigger thing, and I'll explain why. So what I was thinking of, it's obvious in the West that some of these movements have of ideas, the ideas that are out there, which is usually, when I talk about populism in the book, I refer to it as populism, nationalism together, but I didn't want to go into that territory because we had incredibly little time. But my feeling was, if you look at, let's say, and I'm not making any other comparisons because the rise of fascism in Europe in the interwar years, which was obviously a much more extreme form of this, they did pretty well with the printing press. And once they got into power, they did very well with the radio. And so my feeling, but there's an important point here where I do agree with you. My feeling is that for the dissemination of ideas of this kind, old media did pretty well, and I'm not completely persuaded, completely persuaded that social media has changed things quite as much as all that, with one crucial difference, which may be as much institutional as technological, but it's something I'm thinking about. So, which is the parties. In the great revolutionary movements, left and right, of the first half of the 20th century, were militarized party structures of various kinds. So that's an extreme version, right? These militarized party structures were remarkable institutional phenomena. You get them all over the place. Mexico, China, of course, and all over the West. And they were the ones who mobilized this. The parties have disappeared in that form. They're not militarized in that way. And so the movements now are much more diverse and individual, with one exception, which seems to me universal characteristic of all this, the connection between a vast number of people and a leader. And that's common. But it's deinstitutionalized. The party structure is not what it was. I will leave aside India here. You know this much better than I do, which I think is more old-fashioned in this way. But anyway, in that regard, the social media phenomenon may be very, very important in the way relations are created. I'm thinking, for instance, of Donald Trump, between a man and a mass of supporters, within which the institution is in fact a shell. Now that comes to your question. Why did parties get hollowed out? I would argue, I think the reverse of what you're saying. I think there are two factors. One, economic institutions change, and the most important, on the left anyway, the right parties, with the exception of the fascist parties, never really had this structure of any type. In the left, the core structure were trades unions. Trades unions disappeared. That's an economic change because their base disappeared. And so left parties became individualistic. All parties moved, because this was part of election to primaries. And so actually individual members, though not institutionally attached, became more important. The essential consequences of this is parties ceased to be significant mobilizing forces. And that's true not just at extremes, but radically so in the center. So we're doing democratic politics without parties. That's a very big deal, which I don't discuss enough in the book, but I learnt a lot about. And I think that's really interesting, at least in our countries. Mercantilism and nationalism, I agree completely. And that, of course, then gets you to the big point, is what is a global era about? A globalization era, because it's always a combination of integration of capitalism and the competition of capitalisms. So you then get into the great debate of the late 19th, early 20th century. Lenin was in this, of course, big time, about what global capitalism means. What I will accept for this purpose is it has a very strong competitive element. Once you've got this competitive national power competition element in it, once you've got the competitive element in it, you can simultaneously see your country as in a global fight for markets and economic dominance on the one hand, and at home that global fight is reinforced by mobilizing the people behind the national project, you've got a nationalist, mercantilist system which in a democracy will almost inevitably take populist authoritarian forms. And that may well be where we're ending up. If this is where we're ending up, I think we end up in war. That really frightens me. I haven't got quite there. Then that leads to Suman's question. The answer to your point is, if you're trying to be reasonable rather than thinking about ending up in war, going far too long, apologies, but these questions are so wonderful. I suppose the way the international system actually worked on the trade side, which is what I know best, is you could basically do whatever you wanted, however stupid or intelligent, as long as you didn't matter, right? The reason the Uruguay round came, what was the Uruguay round about? The Uruguay round was an attempt by the developed countries to force developing and emerging countries to participate. Why did they think that was important? Because some of these countries have become really quite important. And it was quite clear they were going to become much more important. And they were no way were they going to allow their markets to continue to be as open as they were before if these countries did not in some obvious way reciprocate. So you can think of the external pressure on Indian policy, even more on Chinese policy, is all about that. So the limits of your sovereign autonomy come along when you start depending on foreign countries that don't recognize your sovereign autonomy. That's international relations. The GATT system is no more than a way of organizing international relations. My answer to Danny is yes. If you're a very small economy, no one will give a damn. You can do whatever you like. If you're a very, very big power and you insist that you can do whatever you want, people will retaliate, and then you're going to find that your autonomy is limited. So I think that as long as you're part of an international system in which you depend significantly on other sovereign powers for your prosperity, you are bound to be dragged into negotiations which constrain your autonomy. And then we can only start discussing what the nature of those negotiations is and where the limits lie. That's permanently up for grabs. That's permanently up for grabs. But putting forward the general principle that we can have a set of rules that allow a country to do more or less what it wants, well, we can't agree on those rules. There will be no agreement on those rules, and if the Chinese try it vis-a-vis the Americans, they'll get absolutely nowhere, and vice versa. I think I've dealt with the political party question as best I can. All of these are, of course, tiny footnotes to immense questions about our global future.
Excellent. Pratap, did you have some comments?
One quick thought on Suman's, and which relates to the nationalism question. So when I think, when we think of India's integration into the global economy, and I think this more generally to it, I think we can now also talk about China in this way. Frankly, our approach to integration has actually very little to do with these large philosophical questions about what's optimal integration, what's good tariff policy, what's a multilateral system. It has entirely been driven by our domestic failures, right? 91, we opened up because at the backs of a crisis. Then we had about 20, 25 years, 30 years. And in the last 10, 15 years, we did not do zilch to make us competitive, right? IT landed to us on a platter. We were lucky with global energy prices, right? But the fact is, we were never an export-oriented economy, not because anything to do with the global trading system. Your domestic credit system is broken, your logistics are more expensive, your energy is more expensive. Now, having realized that failure, right? We say, okay, we'll do Make in India, but you're not prepared for that idea, so you still want global soft money to come in. And so, and frankly, it's entirely being driven by the domestic political economy of failure, right? I wish there were a better narrative about, yes, there's an ideological pathway and we are now nothing. And which is why we don't have a policy. Do we want to integrate or do we not want to integrate, right? If you want competitive exports, Surjit's favorite point, and you want to devalue a slightly different exchange rate to make exports competitive, why go after premature financialization? To benefit whom? Particular sections of the domestic political economy that needs to tap into global capital markets. So the drivers of globalization in big countries will be their domestic political economies. Yeah. And ours is so messed up that it's hard to say that this is about integration versus not. And I think China has reached that point. I mean, I think one of the reasons you're getting this conflict, why it's happening 3 years after the exchange rate, is you could still run some kind of plausible story till 3 to 4 years ago. And the US was divided on it, right? There were the China hawks, the China doves, will China liberalize? It's very clear now that China's domestic political economy for the continuance of Communist Party rule requires more severe internal repression and control, right? This is not the Deng era. It requires more concentration of power, right? No wonder it will take a different approach to globalization, and no wonder the US will respond differently, right? The big lesson of the 1930s, right, that was the big Polanyi story, which is it's actually your domestic economic and political contradictions that will drive your globalization. And I think with the crisis in India, the crisis in China, we are in a very different position. I think the US is still has enough flexibility in the system to maybe able to cope with it best, and which is why the US economy will do well. I think Britain will do better than Germany and France, strangely, despite Brexit, right?
Well, I hope you're right.
Right.
Sujit,
Yeah.
any last
So, 2 points. One, and over that my perspective is that it is globalization combined with information revolution that is driving the world, both the economies of the developed world and the developing world. Domestic autonomy is gone. Now, it's not a 0-1, but in gradations. I see no distinction between India's economy and political economy being influenced by globalization and the US economy being determined by globalization. Let me just give you one piece of statistic that I think really supports that notion. And you had very correctly mentioned, and it's an important point, about real household incomes and productivity growth in the developed world having not gone up. It's a mirror image of real household incomes and productivity growth in the developing world. One begets the other. And that is the linkage that we need to understand, I think. That is what has driven the world. That is what dictates foreign policy, etc. The developing world, and think of them as the new elite, and the old elites being the advanced world. The same tussle is happening internally within countries as is happening externally. And Suman, I liked your rules-based disorders. I think that's what is happening. We are playing by the same rules. Everybody's playing by broadly the same international rules. But it appears to be much more disorderly because there are many more players playing the game rather than 1 or 2 countries or 3 or 4 countries.
Thank you. So we've gone 15 minutes over time. I must apologize. There might be some discontentment. I'm seeing fallen faces, but not to be biased towards the front seaters, but we really have gone over time. Thank you all very much. I want to recommend one book which has just come out. It's by Garrett Jones from George Mason University, and it's titled 10% Less Democracy: Why We Must Listen a Little More to the Elite and a Little Less to the Masses. It's a provocative title, but I recommend it. It's come with... well, we'll see. We'll see. Thank you all for your time. Please, there's coffee outside.